My name is Anya, and I am a 29-year-old nanny. I come from a quiet village in the Philippines, a place where ambitions are often set aside in favor of tradition. For most of my life, I believed my future was predetermined. Marriage to a man chosen by my family, a life dedicated to raising children in a home that would never feel truly mine. But I longed for something different. 2 years ago, I arrived in the United States with hopes of forging a new path. I was hired by the Thompsons, a wealthy family in Massachusetts, to care for their 2 children, Lily and Brandon. The position seemed ideal, or so I thought. Caroline, the mother, was gracious and warm, while her husband Mark was initially reserved but courteous. The children quickly took to me, and I adored looking after them. Yet here I am, sitting alone in my modest room, weighed down by guilt. I am harboring a secret so heavy it consumes me daily. I am having an affair with Mark. Even as I write these words, shame knots my chest. Caroline trusts me implicitly. She has often expressed gratitude for the care I provide, the meals I prepare, and the peace I bring to their home. And yet, I have betrayed her in the most unforgivable way. This was never my intention. I did not come here seeking this, but Mark has a way of making me feel seen and valued like no one else ever has. Now I find myself ensnared in a dangerous mix of desire and deceit, unable to escape but suffocated by the consequences. Every day I tell myself to end it, to walk away, but the thought of losing him, even though he was never truly mine, is unbearable. This secret affair is my greatest pleasure and my deepest regret. How did I end up here, a simple girl from the Philippines with dreams of a better life, hiding in the shadows of another woman's home? To understand, you must know how it began. When I first set foot in the United States, everything felt foreign and overwhelming. The air was brisk and sharp, far colder than anything I'd experienced at home, and the streets seemed impossibly vast. I had never been so far from my family, and as I stepped out of the airport into a rush of taxis and strangers, doubt gripped me. Why was I here, thousands of miles from everything familiar? The Thompsons greeted me upon arrival at their expensive house in Massachusetts. It was a grand estate with tall columns, lush gardens, and wide windows that shimmered faintly under the pale winter sun. Caroline, a graceful woman in her late 30s, was the first to welcome me. She embraced me warmly and said, "We're so glad you're here, Anya." Her words were simple, yet they filled me with a sense of belonging I hadn't anticipated. Mark appeared shortly after, holding their youngest, Lily, in his arms. He offered me a brief but sincere smile and extended his hand. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm and deep. Lily and Brandon charmed me from the start. Lily, at 3 years old, had curly brown hair and an infectious giggle, while Brandon, 6, was more reserved, always clutching a toy or a book he preferred to keep to himself. They followed me eagerly as I unpacked, bombarding me with questions about my homeland and my cooking skills. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustments. I spent my days tending to the children, preparing meals, and keeping the house in order. Caroline was frequently occupied with work and social engagements, leaving early and returning late. Mark, however, worked from home more often than I had anticipated. His office was upstairs, and though he largely kept to himself, his presence became increasingly noticeable. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was polite but distant, immersed in his work or distracted by his phone. He seemed to love his children, but wasn't particularly hands-on. I assumed he was simply another busy American father, focused on providing for his family. But as time passed, subtle changes emerged. The gentle tone in his voice when he addressed me, the way his gaze lingered a fraction too long when we crossed paths, the casual inquiries about my day, even when Caroline was present. Initially, I brushed it off as mere kindness. It wasn't until one evening, several months after I had settled in, that everything shifted. I had just tucked the children into bed and was tidying the kitchen when Mark entered. He wore casual jeans and a sweater, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he'd just run his hands through it. "You don't have to do all that," he said, gesturing to the dishes I was scrubbing. "It's part of my job," I replied with a smile, though my hands trembled slightly as I worked. He leaned against the counter, watching me for a moment. "Still," he said, "you do more than enough around here. Caroline and I are lucky to have you." Something in his tone made me pause. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the polite attention of an employer. It was something else entirely. I finished the dishes quickly and excused myself, retreating to my room. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way his voice had softened, the way his eyes had lingered on mine. From that night on, things began to change. Mark seemed to find more excuses to be around when I was alone. He would ask for my opinion on trivial matters, linger in the kitchen while I cooked, or offer to help with tasks that didn't require his involvement. And though I tried to ignore the fluttering in my chest whenever he was near, it became harder with each passing day. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew the truth. Something was building between us, something that scared me as much as it excited me. The night everything changed, I had no idea what was coming. It was a quiet evening, the kind that usually lulled me into a sense of security. Carolyn had gone out for a charity dinner, dressed in a sleek black gown, her hair swept up elegantly. Mark stayed home, saying he needed to finish some work, and I was left to my usual routine of putting the children to bed and tidying up. I remember humming softly to myself as I folded laundry in the living room. The house was still, the kind of peaceful quiet that often followed the children's bedtime chaos. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Mark standing in the doorway. He wasn't in his usual button-down shirt and slacks, but a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy. "You're still working?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "It's just laundry," I replied, smiling briefly. He stepped closer, sitting down on the armrest of the couch. "You know you don't have to do it all, Anya. You already do so much for us." "I don't mind," I said, though his words made something flutter inside me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just watched me fold the clothes, his expression unreadable. Then, almost hesitantly, he said, "You're incredible with the kids. They adore you." I felt a blush creeping up my cheeks and kept my focus on the clothes in my hands. "Thank you. They're wonderful children." "And you," he continued, his voice dropping slightly. "You've made our lives so much better. I don't know how we managed before you came." There was something in the way he said it that made my heart race. I glanced up at him and our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. "Mark," I started, but before I could finish, he leaned forward and kissed me. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It was full of longing, of suppressed emotions breaking free all at once. For a split second, I froze, my mind screaming at me to stop, to push him away. But then something inside me gave in. I kissed him back, my hands trembling as they reached for him. The laundry slipped from my lap, forgotten as Mark pulled me closer. His hands were warm, steady as they rested on my waist. I could feel the strength in his arms, the way they held me like I was something precious. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, I couldn't bring myself to look at him. My heart was pounding, and a wave of guilt crashed over me. "We can't do this," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I know," he replied, but the way he looked at me told a different story. That night, I lay awake in my bed, replaying the kiss over and over in my mind. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had shifted between us. Something I couldn't ignore. The next day, I avoided him as much as I could. I focused on my duties, keeping my interactions with him brief and professional, but every time our eyes met, I felt the same pull, the same undeniable connection. It wasn't long before we crossed the line again. This time, it was in the kitchen. I was chopping vegetables for dinner when he came up behind me, his presence sending a shiver down my spine. "Anya?" he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, and before I could say anything, he cupped my face in his hands and kissed me. It was different this time, slower, deeper, as if he was savoring every moment. From that point on, there was no going back. Our affair began in earnest, filled with stolen moments and whispered secrets. We would meet in the early hours of the morning, when Caroline and the children were asleep, or during the brief times when the house was empty. Each time felt more dangerous than the last, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Mark had a way of making me feel alive, of making me forget the loneliness I had carried with me for so long. But even in the midst of our passion, I couldn't escape the nagging guilt that followed me everywhere. As much as I tried to ignore it, the weight of what we were doing was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Living a double life was both thrilling and exhausting. By day, I was the devoted nanny, playing with Lily and Brandon, helping with their homework, and ensuring the household ran smoothly. By night, I became something else entirely, a woman caught in a whirlwind of forbidden passion. Mark and I became experts at hiding our affair. We avoided eye contact when Caroline was around, kept our conversations brief and casual, and made sure our stolen moments were hidden behind locked doors or during times we knew no one would disturb us. One afternoon, while Caroline was at her yoga class, Mark and I found ourselves alone in the house. I was organizing the children's toys in the playroom when he walked in, shutting the door quietly behind him. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low but teasing. "I haven't," I replied quickly, though we both knew it wasn't true. He stepped closer, the intensity in his gaze making my heart race. "Anya, you don't have to feel guilty every time you look at me." I looked away, my hands fumbling with a stack of building blocks. "Caroline doesn't deserve this," I whispered. "And what about what I deserve?" he countered, his voice softer now. "I've been happier these past few months than I have in years. That's because of you." I didn't know how to respond to that. His words made my chest tighten with both guilt and longing. Before I could think of what to say, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers brushing my skin. "Anya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." It was moments like these that made it impossible for me to walk away. When he looked at me like that, when he spoke to me in that quiet, heartfelt way, I felt like I was the only person in the world who mattered to him. But the reality of our situation was never far from my mind. Every time I saw Caroline laughing with her children or thanking me for taking care of them, the guilt hit me like a wave. I started to question everything, my choices, my feelings, even my worth. How could I betray someone who had shown me nothing but kindness? And yet I couldn't bring myself to stop. Our secret moments grew more frequent and more daring. There were stolen kisses in the kitchen when the children were playing outside, whispered conversations late at night when everyone else was asleep, and even a few brief encounters in his car when Caroline was out running errands. One night, after the children were in bed, Mark and I sat together in his office, the door locked to ensure no one would walk in. He poured us each a glass of wine, something he rarely did, and we sat in silence for a moment before he spoke. "Do you ever regret this?" he asked, his voice quiet. I hesitated, swirling the wine in my glass. "Every day," I admitted. "But that doesn't mean I want it to end." He reached for my hand, his fingers threading through mine. "Neither do I," he said softly. The weight of his words stayed with me long after I left his office that night. As much as I wanted to believe that what we had was real, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The guilt was like a shadow, always lurking, always there. No matter how much Mark tried to reassure me, I couldn't silence the voice in my head that reminded me of the betrayal I was committing every single day. Caroline's kindness only made it worse. She often told me how much she appreciated me, how lucky they were to have me in their lives. Her trust in me was unwavering, and that trust felt like a knife twisting deeper with every moment I spent with her husband. One afternoon, Caroline and I were sitting in the living room while the children napped. She was scrolling through her phone, sipping tea, and suddenly looked up at me with a smile. "Anya," she said warmly, "you've been such a blessing to this family. I don't know how we managed before you came." Her words, meant as a compliment, hit me like a blow. I forced a smile, mumbling a thank you, but inside, I felt like I was crumbling. How could I look her in the eye knowing what I was doing behind her back? That evening, I stayed in my room longer than usual, avoiding Mark's usual attempts to draw me into conversation. I stared at the ceiling, replaying Caroline's words in my mind. Was it worth it? Was the passion and connection I felt with Mark worth the betrayal of a woman who had treated me like family? But when Mark knocked on my door later that night, all my resolve melted away. He stood there, his expression serious, and without a word stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I know you're upset," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed. "It's not right," I blurted, my voice trembling. "What we're doing, it's wrong, Mark. Caroline doesn't deserve this. The kids don't deserve this." He reached for my hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through me. "I know it's complicated, Anya, but us, it feels right to me." His words were like a balm to my guilt, soothing me even as they added to the turmoil inside me. I wanted to believe him, to believe that what we had was something more than just a fleeting affair. But the weight of what we were doing was becoming too much to bear. In the days that followed, I threw myself into my work, trying to create distance between us. I avoided being alone with Mark, ignored his texts, and kept my interactions with him as brief as possible. But it was like trying to hold back the tide. No matter how much I tried to resist, I couldn't escape the pull he had on me. One evening, I sat in the children's playroom, watching Lily and Brandon build a tower with their blocks. Their laughter filled the room, pure and untainted by the messiness of adult life. For a moment, I envied them, their innocence, their freedom from guilt and regret. Lily looked up at me with her big brown eyes and said, "Anya, will you stay with us forever?" Her words made my chest tighten. I forced a smile and said, "I'll be here for as long as you need me." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. I couldn't keep living this double life. Something had to change. Chapter 6. The Turning Point. Everything came to a head one evening when Caroline came home earlier than expected. I had spent the day trying to avoid Mark, busying myself with errands and chores, but he'd cornered me in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious. "Mark, not now," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the hallway. "Anya," he said, stepping closer, his hand brushing mine. "We can't keep doing this halfway. The sound of the front door opening cut him off. My heart leapt into my throat as Caroline's voice called out, "I'm home!" Mark froze, his hand still on mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then, as if waking from a dream, he stepped back, his expression unreadable. I quickly turned to the sink, pretending to wash a dish as Caroline walked into the kitchen. "Hey," she said cheerfully, setting her purse on the counter. "You're both still up?" "Just finishing up some work," Mark said smoothly, his voice steady. Caroline didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, but the close call left me shaken. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if she'd walked in a few seconds earlier. The risk we were taking felt too great, and for the first time, I started to question whether this affair was worth it. The following day, Mark tried to talk to me again, but I avoided him, claiming I was busy with the children. I needed time to think, to figure out what I wanted. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, Mark knocked on my door. This time, I let him in. "We need to stop," I said before he could say anything. His brow furrowed and he stepped closer. "Anya, I know you're scared." "It's not just fear," I interrupted, my voice shaking. "It's wrong, Mark. Caroline trusts me. The kids love me. I can't keep betraying them like this." He sat down on the edge of my bed, running a hand through his hair. "Do you think I don't feel guilty? I do. Every day. But I also know that what I feel for you is real. I can't just turn it off." His words made my heart ache, but they didn't erase the guilt. "It doesn't matter how we feel," I said softly. "We're hurting people who don't deserve it." For the first time, I saw something close to vulnerability in his eyes. "Anya," he said, his voice breaking, "I don't know how to let you go." I looked away, tears stinging my eyes. Maybe it's time we figure out how. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I avoided Mark as much as possible, pouring all my energy into caring for Lily and Brandon. But even as I tried to move on, the weight of our affair lingered, a constant reminder of the lines we had crossed. One evening, Caroline asked me to sit with her while the children played outside. She poured us both a cup of tea and said, "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" For a moment, I thought about telling her the truth. The words hovered on the tip of my tongue, but I couldn't bring myself to say them. Instead, I forced a smile and said, "I've just been a little tired. Nothing to worry about." She nodded, her eyes filled with concern. "You work so hard, Anya. If you ever need anything, just let me know." Her kindness made my guilt feel unbearable. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't keep betraying Caroline and pretending everything was fine. The next morning, I wrote a resignation letter. I didn't explain the real reason for my departure. How could I? Instead, I told Caroline that I needed to return to the Philippines to take care of my aging parents. When I handed her the letter, she looked shocked. "Anya, are you sure? Is there anything we can do to help?" "No," I said, forcing a smile. "This is something I have to do." Mark didn't say much when he found out I was leaving. He cornered me in the hallway one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and frustration. "Is this really what you want?" he asked. "It's what I need," I replied, my voice firm. The day I left, Caroline hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. Lily and Brandon clung to me, begging me to stay, and it took everything in me not to break down. Mark stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. As the taxi pulled away from the house, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. I knew I was making the right choice, but it didn't make the pain any less real. Even now, as I sit in my tiny apartment far away from the Thompsons, I still think about them. I wonder if Caroline ever suspected anything, if Mark has moved on, if Lily and Brandon remember me. But more than anything, I wonder if I'll ever forgive myself for what I did, for the love I stole, the trust I betrayed, and the life I left behind.